Hi, thanks for joining me on the paper once again. My name is Gladys Ambodibang. This very bright morning, we will be talking this morning about the SDF, the Post newspaper, which tells us about the SDF, that is the Social Democratic Front Party, and how Frundi has been re-elected Northwest candidate for the national chairmanship. That is towards the National Convention countdown that takes place in February this year. And according to what he told the Post newspaper, he says he has accepted wholeheartedly to be the flag bearer at the forthcoming National Convention of the Social Democratic Front Party, slated for February 21 to 23rd, 2018. In the Northwest Regional Headquarters, Bamenda. The paper tells us that the thank you says that the regional chairman of the Northwest, Honorable Varistus Njong, and his team for organizing the regional conference that brought together more than 550 delegates who took part in the selecting not selecting only the chairman, but a host of others that will contest during the convention that has been slated for February 22 to 23, 2018. You have the details on that on page 10 of today's edition of the Post newspaper, which equally tells us about the presidency that is frustrating acceleration of the decentralization process in Cameroon. And according to the Post newspaper this morning, a document that contains the strategies that for the acceleration of the decentralization process in Cameroon, it has been laying fallow in the drawers of the presidency of the Republic 5 months after government submitted it for approval. The paper tells us that known as the National Decentralization Strategy, the document is yet to get the approval of the A2D powerhouse that the Secretary of the National Decentralization Council, led by Luc Messi Atangana, sent the document to the presidency since September 12, 2017. If you want the details on that story, you read page 6 of today's edition of the Post newspaper. Then the Post tells us how unidentified gunmen have attacked the Bengui B camp, that is in the Momo division in Northwest Cameroon. And according to the Post newspaper this morning, it says that there were rumors that were going around in Bengui, the chief town of Momo division in the Northwest region, that a group of unidentified persons have attacked the B camp. And the paper tells us that the MP Etna Mba said that the SDO told her that in order to preempt such an attack in the area, the B elements started shooting on every angle that night to dissipate any such attempts, given that the rumors of the surprising attack were wild in Bengui, in the headquarters of the Momo division. And then the paper tells us again, still in Bamenda in the Northwest region, that fire got the Bamenda main market over the weekend. And the paper says that the ravaging fire has burned down part of the Bamenda main market, situated along the Commercial Avenue, chief town of Bamenda. The locals say the fire broke out at around the early morning late at 9 p.m. That was on Friday, when most of the shops had closed for the day. The fire consumed mainly shops lined along the New Life supermarket, and it was thanks to the intervention of the Bamenda Intervention Battalion unit that the fire was doused, preventing it from ravaging the entire market. If you want the details on that story, read page 3 of the Post newspaper. And then we remain in Bamenda in the Northwest region of Cameroon, where we hear population flood to Kumba as the Northwest region as the military hunts Odeshi boys, that is in the Meme division precisely. The paper tells us how hundreds of families rendered homeless owing to a military crackdown on suspected Ambazonian forces accused of triggering unrest in villages across Monge subdivision continues streaming into Kumba and the Northwest regions of Cameroon. Read the details of that story on page 3 of the Post newspaper. Then let's talk about the Eden newspaper this morning. It talks about carnage in Meme division, that is in the Southwest region of the country. It talks how corpses litter all over the area, and how the outrage as 96-year-old woman has been burnt alive. It tells us that villages and churches or church houses have been burned down. Kwakwa, Nake, Bole, Kombone, and Bonge, and some other villages in the Meme division have all been burned down, and some in the Nzian division have been deserted. We have panic. That is panic in Kumba as gunshots rent the air. You have all the details. You have the details on all this in today's edition of the Eden newspaper. Then the Eden newspaper talks about the opposition in Cameroon and question: can an opposition without history of unity regroup to oust the head of state, Paul Biya? That is the question the Eden newspaper asked this morning. You have that on page 3. Read the answer in this edition of the Eden newspaper, which equally tells us about Northwest SDF that endorses Frundi for national chairman. Bird searches for presidential candidates. The page 7 of the Eden newspaper has the details of that meeting where Frundi was endorsed as the national chairman of the main opposition party, the SDF. And then we have sacked Shanti naval workers to storm the company with their children and their wives. If you want the details on that, read page 6 of the Eden newspaper. Let's move over to the Star newspaper. It equally captions on the Anglophone crisis and talks about Meme that has been trapped in bullets and in fire. It says many has been killed. Houses have been burnt in Kwakwa, Mbonge, Kombone, and Ikiliwindi. It tells us how Cameroon forces engage Ambazonia militia in fierce gun battle, and reports say both sides have recorded fatalities. The details you have in this edition of the Post or the Star newspaper, beg your pardon. Then still talking about the situation in the southwest region of Cameroon. It tells us that each time a military truck comes in, people sleep in the forest. That is Sisiko Ayoktabe's ancestral homeland residents that told the Post or the Star newspaper. And it tells us how 12 detained Ambazonian leaders are due to appear in Nigerian court on January 22, which is today, Monday. And there's still internet, though the paper tells us how internet is still epileptic in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. Then we have Cameroon to host Accra General Assembly in December 2018. The paper tells us how the announcement came during the African Communication Regulation Authorities Network meeting that held for 5 days in the nation's capital, Yaoundé. If you want the details of that story, then you read page 2 of today's edition of the Star newspaper. Let's move over to the Guardian Post this morning, which equally tells us about detained Ambazonians, leaders that lawyers block from seeing them. The paper says that the development has further fueled worries about the exact whereabouts of Sisiko Ayoktabe, 11 others arrested on January 5 in Abuja, Nigeria. You have the details in today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper, which equally tells us that in the Meme division in southwest Cameroon, there are fears that many have died in gun battle between soldiers and Ambazonian fighters in Kwakwa, a locality in the Meme division, and tells us how a 96-year-old woman has been burned to ashes in one of many houses set ablaze. Then it tells us how the United Nations has expressed concerns over worsening health of women and children as more Anglophone refugees enter into neighboring Nigeria. You have the details on that in today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper, which is equally interested in the Social Democratic Front Party, the SDF, and tells us how the Northwest SDF backs Fundi's life chairmanship. You have that in today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper. Then let's talk this morning about the Sun newspaper. It tells us about war on separatists. The paper tells us that there is mayhem in Meme division in southwest Cameroon, and informs us that there are killings, burnings, running gun battles between soldiers and the separatists that have rocked Meme division for more than 1 week. And according to the Sun newspaper, a 96-year-old woman has been roasted to death in a burnt house, and villagers along Kumbambonga Highway are completely deserted, or the villages along the Kumbambonga Highway are completely deserted. And Meme senior divisional officer survives Ambazonian fighters' attack. Pages 2 and 3 of the Sun newspaper has the details on that story. And then it tells us how the Minister Are Mengot leads a delegation to bring support to the people of Manyo, or who are war victims, and says government delegate campaigns for dry port in Bamenda in the northwest region of Cameroon. If you want the details on that, then you read today's edition of the Post or the Sun newspaper. Then let's talk about the Voice newspaper. The Voice newspaper tells us that Anglophone detainees staged a drama in a military court, and tells us how General Galim Felix is on trial. You have the details on that in today's edition of the Voice newspaper, which equally tells us about Abuja and Bozonia detainees mystery. It tells us how the United Nations is concerned over safety of women, children fleeing Anglophone Cameroon. And in this edition, you equally read about SDF Shadow Minister Dr. Fomambu that argues for Fundi, and dialogue only path towards resolving the Anglophone crisis. That is the opinion of the United States of America. You have that in today's edition of the Voice newspaper. Let's talk about the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune, which is interested in bilingualism and multiculturalism, and tells us that Switzerland is sharing its experience with Cameroon. The paper says, on the invitation of the National Commission for the Promotion of Bilingualism and Multiculturalism, the Swiss Federal Delegate for Multiculturalism, Nicoletta Mariolini, has started a 5-day walking visit to Cameroon. She's expected to have talks or hold talks with Cameroonian authorities and share Swiss experience on the topic, considering that the country has 4 official languages. Read the details on pages 2 and 3 of Cameroon Tribune, which also informs us that the nations honors our fallen soldiers. The paper says, on behalf of the head of state, the commander-in-chief of the defense forces, the governors of the center, west and southwest regions over the weekend presided at the military ceremonies to bid farewell to soldiers who died at the battlefront in the southwest and northwest regions of Cameroon. The details you have on pages 2 and 3 of today's edition of Cameroon Tribune. Then the paper also reports on Cameroon European Union cooperation and how the ambassador sizes of project. It tells us that during a 3-day walking visit to the far north region of Cameroon that was last week, the head of the European Union delegation to Cameroon examined projects in civil protection, humanitarian relief, agriculture, training, rail electrification, and many other projects which the European Union has pumped in billions of francs CFA. You have the details on that on pages 10 and 11 of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune. And then before we wrap up this edition of the papers, let's talk about Le Financier d'Afrique, which is an economic newspaper. The paper tells us that with the falling quality of services offered by telecommunications companies in Cameroon, that is MTN, Orange, Camtel, and Nextel, the National or the Telecommunications Regulatory Agency has convened the companies to advance explanations about the falling quality of their services. You have the details on that in today's edition of the economic newspaper Le Financier d'Afrique. That paper brings us to the end of today's edition of the paper. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to our programs.